You are listening to the sound of empires crumbling, of iron legions marching out of a land they could never quite tame. Listen closely, and you can hear the echoes of a language lost to time, of warrior clans feuding over mist-shrouded glens. This isn't just a story about Scotland. It's a story about a land forged in chaos, a place where the edges of the known world met the wild unknown. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're listening from somewhere far away, I'd love to know where you are and what time it is for you right now. But for now, let's go back in time to a place where history wasn't written on parchment, but carved into stone and whispered on the wind. It's hard to pinpoint the exact moment medieval Scotland began, mostly because the people living there didn't have a calendar with a big Middle Ages label on it. They were too busy trying to survive, which is a full-time job. But if we have to pick a starting point, it's probably best to look at the massive, world-changing event that wasn't happening in Scotland at all, but rather on its southern border. For centuries, the Roman Empire had been an uninvited, heavily armed guest, and a very grumpy one at that. They'd built Hadrian's Wall, a massive stone barrier that was less a border and more a giant, permanent keep out sign, which the locals mostly ignored. The land beyond the wall, what we now think of as Scotland, was a constant thorn in the empire's side, a place of fierce tribes they called the Picts, the Scots, the Britons, and the Angles. Rome's grand plan to conquer them all never quite worked. And by the 5th century, the empire was starting to feel the strain. The legions were being recalled to defend the heart of the empire from a very different set of invaders. And as they marched south, they left behind a power vacuum of epic proportions. Imagine this. One day, the biggest, baddest bully in the neighborhood packs up his stuff and leaves. All the smaller, scrappier kids who'd been cowering in the shadows suddenly find themselves with a massive, unclaimed playground. That was the situation in post-Roman Scotland. The Picts, a mysterious people known for their intricate stone carvings and fierce warriors, held the north and east. The Scots, who had migrated from Ireland, were settling in the west, in a kingdom they called Dál Riata. Down in the south, the Britons and Angles were establishing their own territories, constantly clashing and forming ever-shifting alliances. It was a chaotic mess, a patchwork of languages and cultures, all vying for dominance. Think of it like a really intense game of musical chairs. But instead of chairs, everyone's fighting over land, and the music is just the constant sound of swords clashing. This period, often called the Dark Ages, was anything but boring. It was a time of epic sagas and heroic tales, though we have to be careful about what we believe, since a lot of it was written down by monks a few centuries later, who probably wanted to make their side look good. A key player in this early drama was Saint Columba, a fascinating Irish monk who sailed to the island of Iona in the 6th century. From this tiny, windswept island, he and his followers began converting the Picts to Christianity. This wasn't just about religion, it was a political move of seismic importance. Christianity provided a common language and culture, helping to bridge the gap between the different kingdoms. The monks of Iona became powerful advisors to kings, and the church became a major political force in its own right. It's like a medieval version of a think tank, but with more prayer and fewer PowerPoint presentations. The Picts, despite their reputation as mysterious barbarians, were incredibly sophisticated. Their fortresses were impressive, and their ability to repel both the Romans and later the Angles from Northumbria speaks volumes about their military prowess. They were ruled by a series of powerful kings, some of whom managed to unite a significant portion of the Pictish territory. However, they were still a fractured people, and their history is a complex web of alliances and betrayals. Historians still argue whether the Pictish language was a Celtic language or an entirely separate one, and their origins remain a topic of intense debate, adding to their enigmatic allure. And then there were the Scots of Dál Riata. They weren't a unified kingdom either, but they had a solid base in Argyll and the islands. They were in a constant state of flux, fighting their Pictish neighbors one minute and raiding the English coast the next. They also brought with them a strong Gaelic culture that would eventually become the dominant force in the region. The eventual union of these peoples wasn't a sudden, peaceful event. It was a long, slow, often brutal process. The Scots, under a series of ambitious kings, slowly expanded their influence. The legend goes that in the 9th century, a king named Kenneth MacAlpin inherited the Pictish throne through his mother's lineage and united the two peoples. The truth is a little more complicated, as it often is, and was probably a gradual process of conquest and intermarriage. But one way or another, a new kingdom was forged from the ashes of the old. This wasn't Scotland yet, not in the way we think of it, but it was the start. It was a new entity called the Kingdom of Alba, and it was a fragile, brand new country trying to find its footing in a very dangerous world. It was a world where Vikings were just starting to show up on the beaches, not for a relaxing holiday, but for a good bit of raiding and pillaging. And so, the stage was set for the next act of this long, winding story. The formation of the Kingdom of Alba was less of a big bang event and more like a slow, deliberate folding of different cultures and territories into a single, cohesive unit. You see, the person often credited with this massive task, Kenneth MacAlpin, wasn't just some random dude who decided to unite a few warring clans. He was a king of the Scots, a group of Gaelic-speaking people who had migrated from Ireland to the western coast of what is now Scotland, establishing the kingdom of Dál Riata. The Picts, on the other hand, had their own kingdom, or rather, a series of kingdoms that covered a significant portion of the north and east. These two groups had been fighting, trading, and intermarrying for centuries. This wasn't a story of one group wiping out the other. It was more like two puzzle pieces that had been bumping into each other for a long time, finally clicking into place, though not without a few jagged edges. The traditional story, a bit like a Hollywood movie plot, suggests Kenneth MacAlpin, having a claim to the Pictish throne through his mother's lineage, simply conquered the Picts and merged their kingdoms. The reality is a little messier, as history usually is. What's more likely is that the Pictish kingdom was already weakening, and the Scots, with their strong ties to Ireland and a robust political structure, were in a good position to take over. This wasn't a sudden invasion, but a gradual process of political maneuvering, strategic alliances, and a bit of good old-fashioned warfare. Kenneth's accession to the throne probably happened around 843 AD, and with it, the Kingdom of Alba was born. Its name, Alba, is the Gaelic word for Britain, but it came to specifically refer to the new kingdom that was taking shape in the north. The creation of Alba was a massive step toward what would become the modern nation of Scotland. For the first time, a single political entity was emerging from the chaos of the post-Roman era, but it was a fragile entity, a kind of political experiment held together by the strong will of a few powerful kings. The early kings of Alba had to deal with a lot. For one, the Vikings were a constant and very serious problem. The Norse raiders weren't just looking for a quick plunder. They were settling, establishing their own powerful earldoms in the north and west. The kings of Alba had to fight them off, and a lot of the early history is a story of these brutal, back and forth struggles. Imagine trying to build a new country while a bunch of guys in longboats keep showing up and burning your villages down. It would be a nightmare. These early kings also had to figure out how to rule a diverse population. The Picts didn't just disappear. Their culture and language persisted for a while, blending with the Gaelic traditions of the Scots. The names of the kings themselves show this blending. For a time, the kings were called the King of the Picts, but eventually they became known as the King of Alba. The Pictish language, though, slowly faded away, replaced by Gaelic, which became the dominant language of the court and the Highlands. This blending of cultures is what makes early Scottish history so rich and complex. It's a testament to the fact that nations aren't just created. They evolve over time, shaped by the people who live there, their traditions, and their struggles. A key development during this period was the establishment of a single line of succession, though it was a messy and often violent process. The Celtic system of succession, known as dynasty, was a bit like a medieval version of who's the most fit to rule. Instead of the crown automatically passing to the eldest son, it could go to a brother, a cousin, or another male relative who was deemed the most capable. This, as you can imagine, led to a lot of infighting and assassinations. It was a brutal Game of Thrones where the loser often ended up with his head on a spike. The kings of Alba had to navigate this system while also trying to create a more stable hereditary monarchy. The king who could manage to kill off all his rivals and secure the throne for his son was the one who usually went down in the history books with a good reputation. It's a little mind-bending to think about the kind of life these kings lived. They weren't sitting in a grand castle all day. They were constantly on the move, leading their armies, holding court in different parts of the kingdom, and trying to keep their unruly nobles in line. The kingdom was a loose collection of earldoms and lordships, and the king's authority was only as strong as his ability to enforce it. The early kings of Alba, like Constantine II and Malcolm I, were master politicians and warriors who managed to hold the kingdom together and even expand its borders, pushing back against the English to the south. and the Vikings to the north. Their success, in a world full of constant danger and instability, laid the groundwork for what was to come. These weren't just local squabbles, but crucial moments in the birth of a nation, a process that saw a new identity emerge from a jumble of ancient peoples. The early kings of Alba had a tough job, to put it mildly. They were essentially nation builders in a world where nations weren't really a thing yet. Their reign wasn't a peaceful stroll through the glens. It was a constant balancing act between fighting off external threats and keeping their own ambitious nobles in line. Imagine trying to run a country where your neighbors are Viking raiders who just want to burn your stuff, and your own relatives are constantly plotting to steal your crown. It's a level of stress that modern politicians can probably only dream of. The first few centuries of Alba's existence were a relentless struggle to solidify a new identity and create a stable, centralized power. They did this by a combination of brute force and clever politics, a timeless recipe for getting things done in the medieval world. One of the biggest challenges came from the sea. The Viking Age was in full swing, and Scotland, with its long, jagged coastline, was particularly vulnerable. Norsemen had established powerful settlements and earldoms in the Northern Isles, the Hebrides, and parts of the mainland. These were not just raiding parties anymore. They were a permanent fixture with their own political structures and military might. The kings of Alba had to fight these powerful Norse warlords tooth and nail. A lot of the early kings' reigns are a blur of battles against the Vikings, sometimes winning, sometimes losing, but always pushing back. For example, Constantine II, who ruled for a whopping 43 years, spent much of his reign fending off Norse incursions. His long tenure, a rarity in that period, gave the kingdom a much-needed period of stability, allowing him to focus on consolidating power and establishing the church as a key ally. The other major threat came from the south. The Kingdom of Northumbria, an Anglo-Saxon power, was a constant rival. The border between Alba and Northumbria was a shifting, bloody mess, a place where armies clashed, and control of key territories was constantly in flux. The kings of Alba had to be just as adept at fighting the English as they were at fighting the Vikings. But they weren't just fighting. They were also negotiating and forming alliances. The famous Battle of Brunanburh in 937 is a great example. King Constantine II of Alba, allied with the King of Dublin and the British King of Strathclyde, faced off against an English army led by King Athelstan. It was one of the biggest and bloodiest battles of the Dark Ages, a clash of empires that shaped the future of Britain. Constantine's coalition was ultimately defeated, but the fact that he was able to unite such a diverse group of enemies of England shows the level of political savvy these early kings possessed. It was a sign that Alba was a force to be reckoned with. Inside the kingdom, the kings faced a different kind of problem: the power of the local chieftains and nobles. The kingdom was a loose collection of earldoms and lordships, and the king's power was not absolute. These powerful families, with their own armies and territories, often acted like mini-kings themselves. The early monarchs of Alba had to constantly tour their kingdom, showing their face, asserting their authority, and keeping the powerful in check. The Celtic succession system, known as dynasty, didn't make things any easier. It was a system where the next king wasn't necessarily the last king's son, but rather the most suitable male heir. This meant that every time a king died, there was a good chance of a civil war breaking out as different claimants fought for the throne. The history of early Alba is full of kings who met a violent end, often at the hands of a rival for the throne. The church played a pivotal role in this process of nation building. The early Scottish church, heavily influenced by Irish monasticism, was a powerful force for unity. The monks of places like Iona weren't just praying. They were acting as diplomats, advisors, and chroniclers. They were the people who wrote down the history, even if they often had a specific agenda. The church provided a common cultural and intellectual framework, and the kings of Alba were smart enough to lean on this. They patronized monasteries, endowed churches, and used the religious authority of the church to legitimize their own rule. The coronation stone, known as the Stone of Scone, was a vital symbol in this process, a place where kings were crowned and their divine right to rule was cemented. It was a perfect blend of old pagan traditions and new Christian beliefs, a powerful symbol of the new kingdom. This wasn't just a mainstream historical fact, it was a cornerstone of their political reality. It gave the kings of Alba a legitimacy that the other, smaller kingdoms lacked. So, while the early kings of Alba might not be as famous as their later successors, they were the ones who laid the foundation for the nation of Scotland. They transformed a chaotic collection of peoples into a single, unified kingdom, an act that was nothing short of miraculous in the brutal, unforgiving world they lived in. The kings who followed would inherit a kingdom that, while still fragile, had a clear identity, defined borders, and a royal house that was ready to face the next round of challenges. The story of the Celtic succession system, or dynasty as it was often called, is a tale of ambition, blood, and a deeply ingrained sense of family loyalty that could turn on a dime. In our modern minds, we're used to the idea of a crown passing from father to son, a simple and predictable line of inheritance. But in medieval Alba, things were a lot more complicated and a lot more violent. The Celts had a different way of doing things, and while it might seem chaotic to us, it was a system designed to ensure that the most capable man, not just the eldest son, took the throne. It was a kind of brutal meritocracy, where you had to be willing to fight your way to the top. This political reality shaped the very character of the kingdom, leading to a constant cycle of dynastic feuds and power struggles that made the job of a king less of a glorious title and more of a life-threatening occupation. The basic principle of dynasty was that the succession wasn't determined by primogeniture, which is the right of the firstborn son to inherit. Instead, the king would be chosen from a group of eligible male relatives, often a brother, a cousin, or a nephew. The heir apparent, or tanaist, was often chosen during the current king's lifetime, which was supposed to provide some stability. But, as you can imagine, this system was ripe for exploitation. When a king died, the best man for the job wasn't always the one who was the most skilled diplomat or a great warrior. It was often the one with the biggest army and the least moral qualms about stabbing his rivals in the back. This led to an endless series of assassinations and civil wars, which is why the reigns of many early kings of Alba were so short and ended so unpleasantly. A great example of this is the story of Macbeth, the real one, not the Shakespearean version with the witches and the talking trees. The historical King Macbeth was a legitimate claimant to the throne under the tanistry system. He killed his cousin, King Duncan III, in battle, a common way to settle succession disputes back then, and ruled for 17 years. This was a long and stable reign, especially for that period, and it shows that while the system was bloody, it wasn't always a recipe for disaster. The problem came when Macbeth himself was killed in battle by Malcolm III, Duncan's son. Malcolm, who had spent years in exile, returned with an English army and a firm belief that he, as the eldest son of the previous king, had the right to rule. This shift in thinking, away from the old Celtic system and toward the Norman-style primogeniture, was a massive change for the kingdom. Malcolm III, with his English connections, and his wife, Queen Margaret, who was an English princess, would eventually cement this change. But it didn't happen overnight. The constant dynastic struggles had a profound effect on the kingdom's development. Kings couldn't afford to be weak. They had to be ruthless and cunning, constantly on guard against their own relatives. This meant that the kingdom's borders were always in a state of flux, and the king's focus was often on internal struggles rather than on external threats. It's not that they weren't worried about the Vikings or the English. It's just that the guy sleeping in the bed next to you was often a bigger problem. The kingdom's political structure was decentralized, with power held by powerful noble families who saw the king as more of a first among equals than an absolute monarch. This was a direct result of the succession system, which allowed powerful men to become king without a clear hereditary line. This wasn't just a political system, it was a cultural one. The idea of a warrior king, a leader who proved his right to rule on the battlefield, was deeply ingrained in the Gaelic psyche. The sagas and epic poems of the time are full of stories of brave kings and their heroic deeds. It was a world where a man's honor and his ability to lead in battle were more important than his birthright. This is a crucial point, and it's something that historians still argue about. Was the Celtic succession system a more democratic or fair way of doing things, ensuring a strong leader? Or was it a recipe for perpetual conflict? It's one of those questions that doesn't have a simple answer, and it shows just how different the medieval world was from our own. As we move forward in our story, you'll see this old Celtic system slowly fade away, replaced by the more familiar primogeniture. But its legacy, a sense of fierce independence and a mistrust of centralized power, would continue to shape Scotland for centuries to come. The era of the warrior king was giving way to the era of the hereditary monarch, and with it, a new chapter was about to begin. The reign of King Malcolm III, who earned the nickname Canmore, meaning Great Chief, marks a pivotal turn in the story of Scotland. The previous section, remember, was all about the brutal, Celtic system of succession that led to so much bloodshed. Malcolm's story, in many ways, is the beginning of the end for that system. His father, Duncan III, had been killed by Macbeth, and Malcolm spent years in exile at the court of King Edward, the Confessor of England. This time in England would have a profound impact on him. He saw firsthand the workings of a more centralized, Norman-style monarchy, a political model that was far more stable than the one he'd left behind in Alba. When he finally reclaimed his throne after killing Macbeth, he brought with him not just a desire for revenge, but a blueprint for a new kind of Scotland. Malcolm's time in England also led to the most significant development of his reign: his marriage to Margaret, a remarkable Anglo-Saxon princess. Margaret was no ordinary queen. She was a devoutly religious woman who had fled England after the Norman conquest in 1066. Her influence on Malcolm and the entire kingdom was immense. She was a force of change, pushing for reforms in the Scottish Church to bring it in line with Roman Catholic practices. She also brought with her a large retinue of English and Norman nobles who were fleeing William the Conqueror. This influx of people, with their different languages, customs, and political ideas, began to fundamentally alter the social fabric of Scotland. It's a bit like a cultural exchange program, but on a massive scale, and with a whole lot of political baggage. Margaret's influence wasn't just limited to the church. She was a major proponent of a more refined English court culture. She encouraged the use of English at court, which was a huge shift away from the Gaelic that had been the language of the kings of Alba. She was also a patron of the arts and helped to modernize the royal household. Her legacy is so significant that she was later canonized as a saint, and she is a key figure in the mainstream historical fact of Scotland's move away from its purely Gaelic roots. The shift from a Celtic, Gaelic-speaking kingdom to a more Anglo-Norman one was a slow process, but it started in earnest with Malcolm and Margaret. Their children, many of whom had Anglo-Saxon names, would continue this trend, cementing the influence of England and the continent on the Scottish royal family. Malcolm himself was a bit of a contradiction. On the one hand, he was a ruthless warrior who spent much of his reign raiding northern England, a kind of payback for the help he'd received to win his throne. On the other hand, he was the king who brought his country out of the Dark Ages and into the medieval period as we more commonly think of it. His marriage to Margaret was not just a romantic union. It was a political alliance that tied Scotland more closely to England. This created a new set of problems, of course. The relationship between the two countries became a tangled web of alliances, betrayals, and royal marriages, a kind of medieval soap opera that would last for centuries. The shift away from dynasty was gradual but persistent. Malcolm III's sons, David III's, Alexander III's, and Edgar would all rule in succession, a clear move towards primogeniture. They were raised in an Anglo-Norman environment, and they brought with them a new political structure to Scotland. They started building a feudal system, creating earldoms and baronies, and giving land to their Norman and English followers. This created a new class of powerful nobles who were loyal to the crown, but it also sowed the seeds of future conflict. The old Gaelic lords, who had been ruling their lands for centuries, weren't exactly thrilled about these new guys showing up and taking over. Historians still argue whether Malcolm III was a hero or just a pragmatic ruler who saw which way the wind was blowing. Was he a true Scottish patriot, or was he simply using his English connections to his advantage? It's a fascinating question, and one that gets to the heart of what it means to be Scottish in this period. The Scotland that Malcolm and Margaret left behind was a very different place from the one they found. It was a kingdom with a new ruling class, a reformed church, and a closer relationship with its powerful neighbor to the south. This new chapter, while it brought stability and prosperity for a time, also set the stage for the conflicts to come. The era of the Golden Age was on the horizon, but it would be followed by a period of chaos and war that would test the very soul of the nation. The reign of King William III, a monarch who came to be known as the Lion, was a testament to the complex and often contentious relationship between medieval Scotland and its powerful neighbor to the south. You see, the era of Malcolm Canmore and Queen Margaret had brought Scotland closer to England, but it hadn't erased the underlying tensions. If anything, it had made things more complicated. William the Lion, a grandson of David the Fern and a descendant of Malcolm and Margaret, inherited a kingdom that was more Norman in its administration than ever before. He spoke French and English. He was a patron of Anglo-Norman culture, and his ambition was, in a very Norman way, to expand his power and territory. His story is a classic tale of a monarch caught between his own desires and the overwhelming power of a dominant neighbor, a theme that will play out again and again in Scottish history. William's nickname, the Lion, didn't come from his brave deeds in battle, but rather from his coat of arms, a fierce red lion rampant on a gold field. This symbol, the lion rampant, would become a lasting emblem of Scotland. But despite the powerful symbolism, William's reign was not always a roaring success. His biggest problem was his desire to reclaim the earldom of Northumbria, a territory in northern England that he believed was rightfully his. This ambition led him to make a series of fateful decisions that would put his kingdom in a precarious position. He allied himself with the English king Henry II's rebellious sons, a risky move that ultimately backfired in a spectacular way. In 1174, during a raid into England, William was captured near the town of Alnwick. This wasn't just a simple capture. It was a total disaster for Scotland. Henry II, a ruthless and brilliant king, saw his opportunity and seized it. He forced William to sign the Treaty of Falaise, a document that was nothing short of a national humiliation for Scotland. The treaty stipulated that William was to pay homage to Henry as his feudal lord, not just for his English lands, but for the entire Kingdom of Scotland. Scotland, for the first time, was a vassal state of England. The treaty also required that Scottish castles be handed over to the English, and that Scottish nobles pay homage to Henry. It was a complete reversal of the progress that had been made in the previous century, and it showed just how vulnerable Scotland was to its southern neighbor. The period of English domination had officially begun, and it wouldn't be easily shaken off. The Treaty of Falaise is a mainstream historical fact that completely altered the course of Scottish history. It wasn't a permanent arrangement, of course. but it established a precedent and a legal framework that English monarchs would use for centuries to justify their claims to Scottish sovereignty. It was a massive psychological blow to the nation and a deeply personal humiliation for William. But William was a shrewd king, and he knew how to play the long game. His chance came when Henry II died, and his son, Richard I, or the Lionheart, took the throne. Richard was more interested in fighting in the Crusades than he was in dominating Scotland. He needed money, and he needed it fast. In a deal that was a bit like a medieval version of a fire sale, Richard agreed to release Scotland from the terms of the Treaty of Falaise in exchange for a massive sum of money. The deal, known as the Quitclaim of Canterbury, restored Scotland's independence and William's sovereignty. The reign of William the Lion, despite its early setbacks, was also a period of significant internal development. He was a great builder, establishing burghs, royal towns, and strengthening the feudal system that had been introduced by his predecessors. He founded the Great Abbey of Arbroath, which would later play a pivotal role in Scotland's fight for independence. He also managed to bring the rebellious province of Moray under control, solidifying the crown's power in the north. He ruled for a very long time, over 48 years, which brought a much-needed period of stability to the kingdom. His long reign allowed the Anglo-Norman culture and feudal structure to become more deeply entrenched, a process that would forever change the character of the nation. It's a bit of a paradox. A king who lost his kingdom's independence, only to regain it and then spend the rest of his life making sure his kingdom was more like the one that had conquered him. And that, my friends, is history for you. The period following the turbulent reign of William the Lion is often referred to as Scotland's Golden Age, and for good reason. It was a time of relative peace and unprecedented prosperity, a kind of blissful calm before the storm that would forever change the nation's destiny. This era, which spanned the reigns of Alexander II and his son, Alexander III, saw Scotland flourish both economically and culturally. It's a bit like the quiet, sunny days of summer before the harvest. Everything seems to be growing and thriving, and you can almost forget that winter is coming. Alexander II, who came to the throne in 1214, was a king of action and diplomacy. Unlike his predecessor, he was less interested in fighting for a lost cause in Northumbria and more focused on consolidating and expanding his kingdom. He was a master of political maneuvering, and his reign was a story of him slowly and cleverly bringing the unruly parts of Scotland under control. He managed to pacify the rebellious lords of Moray and Galloway, bringing them firmly into the royal fold. He also led a successful campaign to subdue the Norse Gaelic lords of the West, a long-standing source of instability. It wasn't always a peaceful process, but his victories meant that the crown's authority stretched further than it ever had before. This was a king who was building a nation, not just ruling one. The most significant event of Alexander II's reign, however, was a diplomatic one. He signed the Treaty of York in 1237, a landmark agreement with England's King Henry III. This treaty, a crucial mainstream historical fact, formally defined the border between England and Scotland. essentially making it the border we know today. This was a massive deal. For centuries, the border had been a messy, bloody no man's land, a place of constant conflict and shifting loyalties. The Treaty of York finally put an end to that, at least for a while. It gave both kingdoms a sense of security and stability, allowing them to focus on internal affairs and economic growth. Alexander II, by securing his borders, had given his people a chance to breathe and build. His son, Alexander III, continued this legacy of stability and prosperity. He inherited a kingdom that was secure, wealthy, and confident. One of his greatest achievements was to finally and permanently bring the Western Isles and the Isle of Man under Scottish control. These territories had been under the rule of the Norse for centuries, but with the power of the Norse kingdom in decline, Alexander saw his chance. After the decisive Battle of Largs in 1263, which ended with a Scottish victory, the Treaty of Perth was signed in 1266. This treaty ceded the Hebrides and the Isle of Man to Scotland, a move that brought the entire country, from the Solway to Shetland, under a single crown. It's hard to overstate how big a deal this was. It was the completion of the kingdom's territorial integrity. The Golden Age wasn't just about military victories and political treaties. It was a time of economic boom. Scottish towns, or burghs, thrived on trade with England, Flanders, and Scandinavia. Wool, hides, and salted fish were the main exports, and Scottish merchants grew wealthy selling their goods abroad. The burghs, with their royal charters and their own local laws, became centers of commerce and culture. It was a period of castle building, of beautiful stone abbeys, and of flourishing arts. The Scots language, a distinct form of English, was beginning to take shape, and the first universities were on the horizon. It was, in many ways, the high-water mark of medieval Scotland, a time when the kingdom was at its most secure, and its people at their most prosperous. Of course, no golden age lasts forever. As we look at this period of peace and prosperity, there's always a hint of tragedy in the air, a sense that it's all too good to be true. Alexander III's reign ended in a shocking and very unlucky way. He had 3 children, but by 1286 they were all dead. His wife had also passed away. The king, a widower with no direct heirs, was in a precarious position. The tragic climax came on a dark and stormy night in March 1286, when Alexander, rushing to meet his new young queen, fell from his horse and was killed. His only surviving heir was his granddaughter, a little girl living in Norway, a child known to history as the Maid of Norway. This sudden and terrible end to the Golden Age would plunge Scotland into a succession crisis, setting the stage for the next and most brutal chapter of its history. The fall from Scotland's Golden Age was swift and tragic, a stark reminder of how fragile peace can be in a world ruled by blood and succession. The story, as we just saw, ended with the shocking death of King Alexander III, who fell from his horse on a stormy night. This event, as dramatic as it was only the first domino to fall in a chain of disasters that would plunge Scotland into chaos. Alexander's 3 children had all predeceased him, and his wife had also passed away, leaving the throne with a single fragile heir, his granddaughter, Margaret, the Maid of Norway. The problem was, she was a 3-year-old girl living across the sea, and a 3-year-old girl is not exactly the kind of person you want in charge of a kingdom, especially not a kingdom with powerful, ambitious nobles and a very hungry wolf to the south. The Scottish nobles, to their credit, tried to handle the situation with as much grace as they could. They set up a provisional government, a group of 6 men known as the Guardians of Scotland, to rule in Margaret's name. Their main goal was to bring the little queen to Scotland and marry her to the right person, a political move that would secure the future of the kingdom. They entered into negotiations with King Edward the Son of England, an intimidating and brilliant king who was already a dominant force in the British Isles. The plan was to marry Margaret to Edward's son, also named Edward, a match that would unite the two royal houses and, in theory, bring a lasting peace. This was a massive gamble. The idea was to create a personal union where the two kingdoms would have the same monarch but remain separate entities. The proposed marriage was laid out in the Treaty of Bergam in 1290. This treaty was a remarkably forward-thinking document for its time. It explicitly stated that Scotland would remain separate and divided from England according to its rightful boundaries, and its laws and customs would be preserved. The Guardians of Scotland, it seemed, had done a good job of protecting the nation's interests. The future looked bright, or at least as bright as it could be, under the shadow of Edward the Rurto. But history, as we know, has a cruel sense of humor. The little queen, Margaret, set sail for Scotland in the autumn of 1290, but she never made it. She fell ill during the voyage and died in the Orkney Islands, a tragedy that left Scotland without a monarch and the royal line completely extinct. Her death was the single most catastrophic event in Scotland's medieval history. It created a complete and utter power vacuum. There was no clear successor to the throne, and a dozen different men, all with some kind of claim to the throne through a convoluted web of royal lineage, suddenly came forward. The most prominent claimants were John Balliol and Robert Bruce, the grandfather of the future king. Both men had strong claims, and both were backed by powerful noble families. Scotland was on the brink of a civil war, a situation that the guardians and the nobles were desperate to avoid. But without a king, the country was rudderless. It's a perfect example of how the medieval mind worked. The absence of a king wasn't just a political problem, it was a cosmic one. The king was seen as God's representative on earth, a divinely appointed leader who held the country together. Without one, the entire social and political order was at risk of unraveling. The Scottish nobles, faced with the terrifying prospect of a brutal and bloody war of succession, did something that in hindsight was both logical and incredibly dangerous. They turned to King Edward III of England to arbitrate the dispute. They asked him to act as a neutral third party, to hear the claims of all the competitors, and to choose the rightful king. The Scots saw him as a powerful and hopefully impartial arbiter. Edward, on the other hand, saw it as the opportunity of a lifetime, a chance to finally and legally assert his dominance over Scotland. And with that decision, the fate of Scotland was placed in the hands of a king who had no interest in its independence. The stage was set for a long and brutal struggle for survival. The decision by the Scottish nobility to ask Edward III of England to arbitrate their succession dispute A process that came to be known as the Great Cause was a moment of immense importance, but also one of incredible naivety. They had just lost their king and their heir, and the country was on the brink of civil war. In their minds, Edward, a powerful and respected king, was the perfect person to act as a neutral judge. They saw him as a kind of Supreme Court justice for the entire island of Britain, a man whose judgment would be fair and final. What they failed to grasp was that Edward, a man whose ambition was as vast as his kingdom, saw this as an invitation to dinner and saw Scotland as the main course. For him, this wasn't about justice, it was about power, and he was about to seize it. The Great Cause was a legal proceeding of immense scale and complexity, a kind of medieval legal drama that unfolded over 2 years, from 1291 to 1292. Edward III's, being a stickler for legal procedure, especially when it benefited him, insisted that all the claimants to the throne present their cases. There were a lot of them, but the real contest came down to two men, John Balliol and Robert Bruce, the grandfather of the future king. Both men were descended from David of Huntingdon, the younger brother of two previous Scottish kings, William the Lion and Malcolm the Fourth. Their claims were based on a mix of legal precedent and genealogical arguments, and the whole thing was a massive headache. The other claimants, with weaker cases, were quickly dismissed. Before he would even begin the proceedings, Edward III made a shocking demand. He insisted that all the Scottish nobles and the claimants acknowledge him as the Lord Paramount of Scotland, meaning they had to recognize him as their feudal overlord, the supreme ruler to whom they owed allegiance. This was a massive power play. The Scots, desperate to avoid war and see the succession settled, reluctantly agreed. They believed it was a temporary measure, a legal formality to get the process moving. They were wrong. Edward had no intention of ever giving up this claim. It was a mainstream historical fact, a legal loophole he had just created, and he would use it for the rest of his life to justify his interference in Scotland's affairs. He had effectively transformed the legal process into an instrument of conquest, all without a single sword being drawn. It was a brilliant and deeply cynical move. The court, with Edward at its head, finally got down to the business of hearing the cases. The argument between Balliol and Bruce was a fascinating one. Bruce argued that he had the stronger claim because he was a generation closer to the royal line, even though he was a descendant through a younger daughter. Balliol, on the other hand, argued for primogeniture, stating that his claim, though through a younger line, was a direct male line from the eldest sister. After months of deliberation, Edward III made his decision in 1292. He ruled in favor of John Balliol. Edward's legal rationale was that the principle of primogeniture should apply, and since Balliol's claim came from the eldest of the three sisters who were the main ancestors of the claimants, his claim was stronger. The decision, though legally sound, was also politically motivated. Edward probably saw Balliol as a weaker, more pliable king who would be easier to control. He had found his puppet. The Great Cause, a process that was supposed to bring peace, ended up doing the exact opposite. While it settled the succession, It did so by placing the Scottish king in a position of subservience to the English king. This created a profound sense of grievance and humiliation among the Scottish nobles, who had just seen their sovereignty given away by a legal trick. The stage was now set for the next act of the drama, one where the chosen king, John Balliol, would try to be a real king, not a puppet. But Edward III, a master of manipulation, had no intention of letting that happen. He had created his king, and now he would control him. The peace was over, and the war was about to begin. Edward I of England was not a man who did things by halves. He was known as Longshanks for his height and the Hammer of the Scots for a very good reason. His ambition to unite the British Isles under his rule was a lifelong obsession, and when the Scottish nobles handed him the power to choose their king, he must have felt like a kid in a candy store. He had his legal pretext. The Scots had acknowledged him as Lord Paramount. And now he had a new king he believed he could control. John Balliol, a man who would become known as Tomb Tabard, or Empty Coat, was Edward's choice for a reason. He was a noble from a powerful family, but he lacked the charisma and ruthlessness of his rival, Robert Bruce. Edward saw him as a puppet, a figurehead who would do his bidding. And for a while, that's exactly what he was. Edward's treatment of John Balliol was nothing short of a sustained campaign of public humiliation. He constantly summoned Balliol to England to answer for the actions of his kingdom, forcing him to kneel and pay homage. Edward would also allow English subjects to appeal a decision made in a Scottish court directly to him, effectively making his court the final court of appeal for Scotland. It was a clever legal trick that completely undermined Balliol's authority and made a mockery of his kingship. Imagine being the king of a country and having to constantly ask a bigger, more powerful king for permission to do anything. It was a recipe for disaster, and a deliberate one at that. Edward was poking and prodding the Scots, waiting for them to react, so he would have a reason to invade. This period of English overlordship, which lasted from 1292 to 1296, was a masterclass in psychological warfare. The Scottish nobles, who had been so happy to see a king on the throne, were now realizing the terrible mistake they had made. Balliol, for his part, was in an impossible position. He couldn't be a strong king without angering Edward. But if he was too weak, he would lose the support of his own nobles. The situation reached a breaking point in 1295 when Edward demanded that the Scots provide military support for his war against France. This was the final straw. The Scottish nobles, fed up with Edward's constant meddling, took matters into their own hands. They created a new council of 12 men to rule in the king's place and signed a treaty with France, an alliance that would come to be known as the Old Alliance. This was an act of open defiance, and it was exactly what Edward had been waiting for. He saw it as a declaration of war. He gathered a massive army and marched north in the spring of 1296. His first target was the border town of Berwick-upon-Tweed, a bustling port that was a symbol of Scotland's economic prosperity. The ensuing sack of Berwick was an act of shocking brutality. Edward's army slaughtered the town's inhabitants indiscriminately, men, women, and children alike. It was a horrifying act of terror, a clear message to the rest of Scotland. Do not mess with me. The Scottish army, led by the hapless John Balliol, was no match for Edward's forces. They were soundly defeated at the Battle of Dunbar, and the country was open for conquest. Edward's army marched through Scotland, seizing castles and subduing the nobility. John Balliol, his spirit completely broken, was forced to abdicate his throne. In a final act of humiliation, he was stripped of his royal regalia, and his coat of arms was torn from his surcoat, earning him the nickname Empty Coat. Edward took the Scottish crown and, most importantly, the Stone of Scone, the ancient coronation stone of Scottish kings, back to England. The Stone of Scone, a crucial mainstream historical fact, was not just a stone. It was the symbol of Scottish sovereignty, and its theft was a final symbolic act of conquest. Scotland had no king, no crown, and no Stone of Scone. It was, in Edward's mind, a conquered province, and the stage was set for the long and brutal wars of independence. With John Balliol's humiliation complete and the Scottish crown and Stone of Scone carted off to England, Edward III believed his work was done. He had, in his own mind, legally and militarily conquered Scotland, turning it into a northern province of his sprawling empire. He appointed English administrators and governors to run the country, and then returned south, confident that he had crushed the Scottish spirit for good. But he had made a fatal miscalculation. He had underestimated the fierce independence of the Scottish people and the resentment that was simmering just below the surface. This was not the end. It was the beginning. Edward's conquest had not brought peace. It had ignited a fire that would burn for decades, a conflict that we now call the First War of Scottish Independence. The war didn't start with a single grand battle, but with a series of small, local rebellions. The English administrators, often corrupt and heavy-handed, were not well liked. They imposed English law and customs and taxed the people mercilessly. This created the perfect environment for a popular uprising. The first great leader to emerge from this chaos was a man who would become a legend, William Wallace. Wallace was not a great noble. He was a commoner, a knight from a respectable but not overly powerful family. His motivations are lost to history, but the legend says he began his rebellion after killing an English sheriff in Lanark for the murder of his wife. Whether that story is true or not, he quickly became a symbol of resistance, attracting followers from all walks of life. Wallace and his men, a kind of guerrilla force, used the wild, untamed Scottish landscape to their advantage. They ambushed English garrisons, raided supply lines, and generally made life a living hell for the English occupiers. He was a charismatic leader, and his small band of rebels grew into a significant army. He was eventually joined by another key figure, Andrew de Moray, a powerful noble who was leading a similar uprising in the north. Moray was just as effective a commander as Wallace, and their forces together were a formidable threat. Their combined armies marched to the Forth River, where they met a much larger and better equipped English army at Stirling Bridge in 1297. The Battle of Stirling Bridge is a mainstream historical fact that is as brilliant as it is famous. The English army, led by the Earl of Surrey, was arrogant and overconfident. They began to cross the narrow wooden bridge, a few men at a time, to engage the Scottish forces. Wallace and Moray, with a tactical genius that would be studied for centuries, waited for the English army to be halfway across the bridge. Then, at the signal, the Scots charged, completely overwhelming the part of the English army that had crossed. The bridge was too narrow for the English to retreat, or for reinforcements to cross. It was a complete and utter disaster for the English, a stunning victory for the Scots, and a moment that put William Wallace on the map as a national hero. Following the victory, Wallace was made a guardian of Scotland, and for a short time, the Scots had their country back. But Edward the Stone was not about to give up. He returned with an even bigger army in 1298, determined to crush the rebellion once and for all. The two armies met at the Battle of Falkirk. Wallace's tactics, which had worked so well at Stirling Bridge, were no match for Edward's new strategy. Edward had brought with him an army of longbowmen, a weapon that was devastatingly effective against the Scottish schiltrons, the tightly packed circles of spearmen that Wallace relied on. The English archers rained arrows down on the schiltrons, breaking their formation and allowing the English cavalry to charge in for the kill. It was a crushing defeat for the Scots, and Wallace's reputation was tarnished. Wallace resigned as guardian and went into hiding, becoming a hunted man. For 7 years, he was on the run, a ghost in the Scottish countryside, but his capture was inevitable. In 1305, he was betrayed by a Scottish knight and handed over to the English. His execution in London was brutal and public, a deliberate act of terror meant to send a message to all who would dare to defy Edward. Wallace was hanged, drawn, and quartered, his body parts sent to different parts of the kingdom as a warning. But Edward's plan backfired. Wallace's martyrdom, far from ending the resistance, only strengthened the Scottish will to fight. His memory became a rallying cry, a symbol of everything the Scots were fighting for. The first phase of the war was over, but the fire he had lit was still burning, waiting for a new leader to fan the flames. William Wallace's name is almost synonymous with Scottish independence, a hero so legendary that his story has transcended history and entered the realm of myth. We left him at the end of the last section, a hunted man after the disastrous defeat at Falkirk and his subsequent capture and execution. But to truly understand his impact, we have to go back and look at what he really represented. Wallace wasn't just a successful warrior. He was a symbol, a lightning rod for the anger and resentment of the common people. He wasn't a duke or an earl, but a knight, a man of the people who was fighting against a corrupt and unjust system. His rise to power from relative obscurity is a perfect example of a popular uprising, a testament to the fact that you don't need a fancy title to lead a revolution. After the victory at Stirling Bridge, Wallace was made a guardian of Scotland, a position he shared with Andrew de Moray, until Moray's death from wounds sustained in the battle. Wallace was now the de facto ruler of Scotland, and he took his job very seriously. He began to organize the country, issuing letters of protection and diplomatic missives on behalf of the kingdom. It's a remarkable thing to think about. A man who had been a local outlaw just a few years earlier was now corresponding with foreign kings and running a country. It was a brief taste of freedom for Scotland, a time when the common man had a voice and a champion. The letter he sent to the Hanseatic League, a powerful trading association, is a key mainstream historical fact. In it, he invited the merchants to resume trade with Scotland, assuring them that the country was now free. It was a bold statement, and it showed that Wallace was not just a warrior, but a statesman with a vision for a free and prosperous Scotland. But his time in power was short-lived. His defeat at Falkirk was a massive blow, and the Scottish nobility, who had been wary of his power from the start, began to turn against him. A lot of the nobles saw Wallace as a threat to their own authority. He wasn't one of them, and his popularity with the common people made him a difficult figure to control. He was a symbol of a popular rather than a feudal uprising, and that made the nobles very uncomfortable. After his defeat, he resigned as guardian, a move that showed he was a patriot who put the country before his own personal ambition. He then disappeared from the historical record for several years, traveling to France in an attempt to get military aid from King Philip IV, a diplomatic mission that ultimately proved to be unsuccessful. His capture in 1305 was a moment of profound sadness for the Scottish people. He was betrayed by a fellow Scot, Sir John de Menteith, and handed over to the English. He was taken to London and put on trial for treason. At his trial, he famously stated that he could not be a traitor to Edward III because he had never sworn allegiance to him. It was a brilliant and defiant defense, a final act of rebellion from a man who had spent his life fighting for his country's freedom. His execution was one of the most gruesome spectacles of the medieval period. A clear message from Edward VI that rebellion would not be tolerated. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered, and his head was placed on London Bridge as a warning. But, as we know, this brutal act didn't work. The legacy of William Wallace was not one of defeat, but of inspiration. He had shown the Scots that they could stand up to the English, that they could fight and win. He had given them a sense of national identity, a shared purpose that transcended the old feudal loyalties. He became a martyr, a symbol of freedom that would be invoked for centuries to come. His legend, though often embellished by later writers, provided a powerful narrative for the next generation of Scottish leaders. It's a fascinating historical debate. Was Wallace a true hero, or was he a ruthless guerrilla leader who was simply in the right place at the right time? Historians still argue about the specifics of his life and his true motivations. What is undeniable, however, is that his actions, his victories, and his ultimate sacrifice made him a cornerstone of the Scottish national identity, a figure who paved the way for the next great leader, a man who would complete the work he started. The name Robert the Bruce is spoken with a hushed reverence in Scotland, a figure who took the fragmented, defeated rebellion left behind by William Wallace and forged it into a triumphant, independent kingdom. But his journey to becoming a national hero was far from simple. In the early stages of the First War of Independence, Bruce was a man caught in the middle. His family was one of the two main contenders for the throne in the Great Cause, and they had a long-standing feud with the Balliol family. This meant that while Wallace was fighting against the English, Bruce was often on the English side, a pragmatic choice that allowed him to protect his family's lands and his own political standing. He swore allegiance to Edward the Fern, and even fought alongside the English at the Battle of Falkirk against Wallace, a detail that many later historians gloss over. It's a fascinating example of how a man's personal ambition and political necessity can clash with a larger national cause. Bruce's conversion from a wavering noble to a determined patriot happened in the years following Wallace's execution. The death of the great commoner and the brutal English occupation must have made him realize that there was no room for half measures. He saw that Edward III had no intention of allowing a Scottish king to rule in any meaningful way, and that the only path to true power was to seize the throne for himself. The pivotal moment came in 1306 when he met with John Comyn, a powerful noble who was a rival claimant to the throne and a relative of the Balliols. The two men met in a church in Dumfries to discuss the future of Scotland, and the meeting ended in murder. Bruce, in a fit of rage, stabbed Comyn and left him for dead on the altar. This act, a violation of the sanctuary of a church, was a shocking and unforgivable crime in the medieval world. It made Bruce a fugitive, an outlaw, and a marked man. But it also eliminated his last major rival for the throne. With Comyn dead and no other major contenders, Bruce acted quickly. He had himself crowned King of Scots at Scone just a few weeks later. The coronation was a rushed and somewhat desperate affair. He was a king with no kingdom, a monarch with no army, and an excommunicated outlaw in the eyes of the church. Edward the Sverden was furious, and he sent a new army north to crush the rebellion. Bruce's early years as king were a complete disaster. He was defeated in battle, his brothers were captured and executed, and he was forced to go into hiding, a fugitive in his own country. Legend has it that during this time, he was hiding in a cave and saw a spider trying to spin a web. The spider failed 6 times, but on the 7th try, it succeeded. This small act of persistence inspired Bruce to not give up, a famous story that has been told to generations of Scottish schoolchildren. The turning point came when Edward the Fund died in 1307. His son, Edward II, was a much weaker and less competent king than his father. This gave Bruce the breathing room he needed. He emerged from hiding and began a brilliant guerrilla campaign using the same tactics that William Wallace had pioneered. He avoided pitched battles and instead focused on ambushing English garrisons, seizing castles, and consolidating his power. He was a master of surprise, and his small, mobile armies became a constant thorn in the side of the English. He also began a campaign of scorched earth, destroying his own castles to prevent the English from using them. It was a ruthless and effective strategy, a classic example of a weaker force using its home field advantage to its full potential. By 1314, Bruce had regained control of almost all of Scotland. The only major English strongholds left were the castles of Stirling and Berwick. Stirling Castle, a fortress of immense strategic importance, was under siege. Edward II, goaded by his nobles, finally decided to act. He gathered a massive army and marched north to relieve the siege, setting the stage for the most famous battle in Scottish history, Robert the Bruce, the one-time turncoat and excommunicated king, was finally going to face his enemy in a direct, pitched battle. It was a moment of incredible tension, a single day that would decide the fate of a nation. The Battle of Bannockburn in 1314 was not just a battle. It was the ultimate showdown, a high-stakes chess match played out on a field near Stirling Castle that would decide the fate of a nation. We left off with Robert the Bruce, the once fugitive king, having consolidated his power and now facing the full might of the English army, led by the less than brilliant King Edward II. The English army was huge, perhaps as many as 20,000 men, and it was a mix of heavily armed knights, foot soldiers, and archers. The Scottish army was much smaller, around 6,000 to 7,000 men, and it was primarily composed of spearmen, organized into those tight, circular formations called schiltrons, a tactic that had failed so spectacularly at Falkirk. This time, however, Bruce had a plan, and it was a brilliant one. He had learned from Wallace's mistakes and was about to turn the English army's strengths into their greatest weakness. Bruce chose his ground carefully. The field was not flat and open, a perfect stage for the English cavalry. Instead, it was a boggy, marshy area with a small stream, the Bannockburn, running through it. Bruce's forces were positioned on a high wooded ridge, a strong defensive position. He also had his men dig a series of small, camouflaged pits, or potholes, and fill them with sharpened stakes, a nasty surprise for any charging cavalry. It was a classic example of a weaker force using the terrain to their advantage, a kind of medieval booby trap that would cause chaos and confusion. The English, as expected, were overconfident. They saw the Scottish army as a ragtag group of rebels and didn't expect a well-thought-out tactical plan. The battle began with a series of skirmishes on the first day. One of the most famous moments came when an English knight, Sir Henry de Bohun, spotted Robert the Bruce, riding on a small pony, and charged at him with his lance, hoping to kill the Scottish king and end the war then and there. Bruce, who was lightly armed, bravely waited until the last moment, then swerved, stood up in his stirrups, and with a single blow of his battle-axe, split de Bohun's head open. It was a moment of immense symbolic importance, a single act of bravery that electrified the Scottish army and showed that their king was not just a politician, but a warrior in his own right. The next day, the main battle began. The English cavalry, eager to break the Scottish lines, charged forward, but they were immediately bogged down by the marshy terrain and were funneled into a tight, constricted area. The hidden pits caused even more chaos, with horses and riders falling and creating a jumbled mess. The Scottish schiltrons, which had been so vulnerable to archers at Falkirk, were now a terrifying force. With the English cavalry unable to maneuver, the spearmen held their ground, presenting a wall of sharpened pikes that the knights could not penetrate. The Scottish archers, positioned to the side, also began to rain arrows down on the English, a tactic that was a nasty shock for the English. The English were squeezed together, unable to use their numbers or their superior weaponry. It was a complete disaster. The English army began to break, and in the ensuing rout, thousands of English soldiers were slaughtered as they tried to flee. Edward II himself fled the field, a humbling and ignominious retreat. The Battle of Bannockburn was a crushing victory for the Scots, a moment of national redemption that secured their independence and cemented Robert the Bruce's place in history as their greatest king. Bannockburn was a decisive turning point, a mainstream historical fact that completely changed the course of the war and the future of Scotland. It wasn't the end of the war. Fighting would continue for another 14 years, but it was the psychological victory that mattered most. It proved, once and for all, that Scotland was not a conquered province, but a free and independent nation, capable of defending itself against its powerful neighbor. The battle also gave Robert the Bruce the legitimacy he had so desperately sought. He was no longer just a usurper. He was the king who had won back the country's freedom. His victory would be celebrated for centuries, and the memory of Bannockburn would become a symbol of Scottish patriotism, a powerful narrative of a small nation standing up to a Goliath and winning against all odds. The stunning victory at Bannockburn in 1314 was a massive win for Robert the Bruce and Scotland, but it wasn't the end of the story. Edward II of England was a sore loser, and he refused to recognize Scotland's independence. He was still the head of a powerful kingdom, and he still had the resources to continue the war. So, while the Scots had their freedom in practice, they didn't have it in the eyes of the world. In the medieval world, this was a problem. Without international recognition, the war could drag on forever, and the Pope, a key figure in European politics, had excommunicated Robert the Bruce for murdering John Comyn in a church. This meant that Bruce's authority as king was in question, and Scotland was an isolated country in the eyes of the Church and the other Christian nations of Europe. To solve this problem, the Scottish nobles and clergy came up with a brilliant plan. They would write a letter, not just to the Pope, but to the entire world, explaining their cause and justifying their right to be a free and independent nation. This letter, drafted in 1320, is one of the most important documents in Scottish history and a powerful statement of national identity. It is known as the Declaration of Arbroath. The Declaration was a masterclass in political rhetoric and a clear articulation of the Scottish people's right to self-determination. It was written in Latin and sealed by the great earls and barons of Scotland, giving it the weight of the entire Scottish nobility. The letter was a formal petition to Pope John IV to recognize Robert the Bruce as the rightful king of Scotland and to stop supporting the English in their war of aggression. But the declaration was more than just a political petition. It was a soaring statement of the Scottish people's identity and their long-standing history as a free people. It laid out a narrative of Scotland as an ancient and independent kingdom, a nation with its own history and traditions that predated the English. The most famous line, and the one that has echoed through the centuries, is a powerful statement about freedom. For as long as 100 of us shall remain alive, we shall never submit to the dominion of the English. For it is not for glory, riches, or honors that we fight, but for freedom alone, which no true man gives up except with his life. This phrase, a cornerstone of the Declaration of Arbroath and a mainstream historical fact, is a timeless articulation of the human desire for liberty. It wasn't about a single king or a single battle. It was about the fundamental right of a people to govern themselves. The Declaration was a strategic and diplomatic triumph. It presented the Scottish cause in a way that resonated with the values of the medieval world. It argued that the Scots were a peaceful Christian people who were being unjustly attacked by a tyrannical king. It also made a clever legal argument, stating that if Robert the Bruce ever betrayed the cause of Scottish freedom, the nobles would depose him and choose a new king. This was a direct appeal to the principle of popular sovereignty, a radical idea for its time, and it showed the Pope that the Scottish cause was not about one man's ambition, but about the will of a nation. It was a subtle threat, a promise that the Scots would not be a tool of the English and would fight on with or without a king. The Declaration of Arbroath, though it didn't immediately end the war, had a profound impact. It swayed public opinion across Europe and put pressure on the Pope to change his stance. Over time, the Pope would lift the excommunication of Robert the Bruce, and the Scottish cause would gain international legitimacy. It's a testament to the power of words and ideas in a world dominated by force. The English, despite their military superiority, couldn't fight the powerful narrative that the Declaration had created. The document became a foundational text for Scottish national identity, a document that would be referenced for centuries to come as a justification for Scotland's right to exist as an independent nation. The war would finally end with the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton in 1328, which formally recognized Scotland's independence. But the Declaration of Arbroath had already won the moral and diplomatic war 8 years earlier. The death of Robert the Bruce in 1329 and the succession of his 5-year-old son, David VI, marked the beginning of a new and troubled chapter for Scotland. The kingdom, which had just fought so hard for its independence, now had a child king on the throne, a recipe for instability in the medieval world. To make matters worse, Edward III, a much more competent and ambitious king than his father, had taken the throne of England. He had no intention of honoring the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton that had recognized Scotland's independence. He saw an opportunity to reclaim the territory and undo the work of Robert the Bruce, and he found a perfect tool to do it. Edward Balliol. Edward Balliol was the son of John Balliol, the empty coat king we met earlier. He had a legitimate, though weak, claim to the Scottish throne, and he was more than happy to be a puppet for the English king. In 1332, with the support of a group of exiled Scottish nobles known as the Disinherited, Balliol invaded Scotland. His army, though small, was well-equipped and ruthless. They caught the Scottish army by surprise at the Battle of Dublin Moor, a shocking defeat for the Scots that saw thousands of their men slaughtered. Balliol was crowned king at Scone, but his reign was incredibly short-lived. He was ambushed by loyalists just a few months later and forced to flee the country, escaping on a saddled horse with nothing but his nightshirt. The Scottish people, it seemed, were not ready to give up the Bruce line. But Edward III was not so easily deterred. He saw Balliol's weakness as an opportunity to intervene directly. He invaded Scotland in 1333, and the two armies met at the Battle of Halidon Hill. The English, using the devastating longbow tactics that had been so effective at Falkirk, completely routed the Scottish army. It was a crushing defeat, and it forced the young King David II to flee to France, a long-standing ally of Scotland, for his safety. This began a period of over a decade where Scotland was a country in name only. It was ruled by a series of regents and guardians who fought a bitter, back-and-forth guerrilla war against the English and their puppet king, Edward Balliol. This conflict is often referred to as the Second War of Scottish Independence. The war was a brutal and destructive affair. The English controlled most of the lowlands, but the Scottish loyalists, led by men like Andrew Murray and Robert Stewart, fought on. They used the same guerrilla tactics that Robert the Bruce had pioneered, ambushing English forces and harassing their supply lines. It was a war of attrition, a constant struggle that drained both sides. David II finally returned to Scotland in 1341, a young man now in his late teens who was ready to reclaim his kingdom. He was a brave and charismatic leader, and his return gave the Scottish cause a much-needed boost. He began to slowly push the English back, but he made a fateful decision in 1346. Thinking that Edward III was preoccupied with his wars in France, David II led a massive invasion of northern England. It was a huge gamble, and it failed spectacularly. The two armies met at the Battle of Neville's Cross near Durham, and the Scots were utterly defeated. David II was captured, and for the next 11 years, he was a prisoner in England. This mainstream historical fact was a massive blow to Scotland. With their king a prisoner, the country was once again rudderless. The English, led by Edward Balliol, made a final push to conquer the country, but the Scots, with the help of the French and a deep-seated resistance, managed to hold on. The war, a bloody and destructive mess, finally fizzled out, but not before it had tested the nation's resilience to its breaking point. David II was eventually ransomed for a massive sum of money and returned to Scotland, but the Second War of Independence had left the country exhausted, and with a king who had no heir, the future of the Bruce dynasty was in question. The stage was set for a new family to take the throne, a family that would rule Scotland for centuries to come. The death of David II in 1371, childless, brought the Bruce dynasty to an end. It was a sad, anticlimactic close to a family that had fought so hard for Scotland's freedom. David II was a king who had suffered immense hardship, exile, capture, and a long imprisonment in England. His legacy was one of resilience, but also one of instability. With his death, the Scottish crown passed to his nephew, Robert Stewart, the son of his sister, Marjorie Bruce. This marked the beginning of a new chapter in Scottish history, the age of the Stuart dynasty, a family that would rule the country for the next 3 centuries. The House of Stuart, a name that would become synonymous with Scotland itself, took the throne at a time of deep uncertainty, and their reign would be defined by both triumphs and tragedies. Robert Stewart, who became Robert II, was a fascinating figure. He was the son of a high-ranking noble family, and his rise to the throne wasn't a matter of conquest, but of legal right. He was the grandson of Robert the Bruce, and his succession was a direct result of the succession acts that had been passed during Bruce's reign. But while his claim was solid, his power base was not. The Stuart family was powerful, but they were still just one of many ambitious noble families. Robert II, a man who was already in his 50s when he took the throne, was not a charismatic warrior king like his grandfather. He was a bit more of a bureaucrat, a man who was more comfortable with administration than with battle. His reign was a period of consolidation, where he tried to establish the Stuart line and control the powerful nobles who constantly jockeyed for power. One of the biggest challenges Robert II faced was the power of the great magnates, especially in the north and west. These powerful earls and lords, who had their own armies and territories, were often a law unto themselves. They were a bit like a collection of mini-kings who paid lip service to the central authority of the crown, but did whatever they wanted. The Stuart kings would spend much of their time trying to rein in these unruly nobles, a constant game of cat and mouse that would define their reigns. Robert II, though, was not a man of war. He was a man of diplomacy and marriage alliances. He spent much of his reign trying to secure his family's position by marrying his children into the other powerful noble families, a strategy that, while peaceful, didn't always work out as planned. The transition to the Stuart dynasty also solidified a major shift in the political landscape of Scotland. The old Gaelic culture, which had been so dominant in the early kingdom of Alba, was now in retreat. The Stuart kings, with their Anglo-Norman heritage and their close ties to the English court, represented a new era. The Scottish language, a form of English, was now the language of the court and the lowlands, while Gaelic was increasingly confined to the highlands and islands. This created a cultural divide that would persist for centuries, with the highlands seen as a wild and untamed place, and the lowlands as the center of civilization. This is a mainstream historical fact, a linguistic and cultural shift that fundamentally altered the character of the nation. Robert II's son, Robert III, who took the throne after his father's death, was a well-intentioned but weak king. His reign was dominated by the internal conflicts of the great noble families, a period of chaos that the king was unable to control. Robert III was an unlucky king. He was injured in a riding accident that left him an invalid, and he was constantly undermined by his own relatives, especially his powerful brother, the Duke of Albany, in a desperate attempt to protect his son and heir, James, from the political turmoil. He sent him to France for his safety, but the ship was captured by English pirates, and the young prince was taken to the court of Henry IV of England, where he would remain a prisoner for the next 18 years. Robert III, heartbroken by the news, died soon after. With the king dead and his heir a prisoner in a foreign land, the Stuart dynasty was off to a very rocky start. The early Stuart kings, from Robert II to Robert III, faced a constant uphill battle for control. The greatest challenge wasn't an invading English army, but the power of their own noble families. You see, Scotland's political landscape was a patchwork of powerful, semi-independent earldoms and lordships. The king was theoretically in charge, but in practice, his authority often didn't extend much beyond his own immediate territories. To these powerful magnates, the king was more of a symbol than a true ruler, a figurehead who needed to be kept in check. This created a political environment that was a constant struggle for supremacy, a bit like a medieval version of a board game, where everyone is trying to take over everyone else's pieces. Robert II, the first Stuart king, was a case in point. He was a well-intentioned but not particularly strong king, and his reign was dominated by the power of his own family, especially his sons and their ambitious relatives. His brother, the Duke of Albany, was a particularly influential and cunning figure who essentially ran the country for much of Robert III's reign. The real power lay not with the king, but with the men who could command the loyalty of the great nobles. The king's job was to try and balance these competing interests, to play one noble family against another, and to use marriage alliances and land grants to secure loyalty. It was a high wire act, and the early Stuart kings were not always successful at it. This internal conflict had a huge impact on the country's development. The constant infighting meant that Scotland was often in a state of chaos, which left it vulnerable to English aggression. The English kings, who had a much more centralized and powerful monarchy, were able to exploit these divisions. They would often support one Scottish noble family against another, a clever strategy that kept the Scots weak and divided. This mainstream historical fact of English manipulation of Scottish internal politics is a crucial theme of the period. The Scots, for their part, would often turn to their old ally, France, for support, a relationship that we know as the Old Alliance. This alliance, though important, wasn't always enough to counter the power of the English king and the internal strife that plagued Scotland. The climax of this period of internal conflict came during the reign of Robert III, a king who was physically and politically weak. His brother, the Duke of Albany, was the real power behind the throne. Albany's ambition was a constant source of friction, and he was known to be a ruthless and self-serving politician. The death of the king's eldest son, the Duke of Rothesay, under mysterious circumstances, was a tragedy that was widely believed to be the work of Albany. It's a moment that highlights just how brutal and cynical medieval politics could be. A father, a king, was powerless to protect his own son from a powerful relative. This is a topic that historians still argue about. Was Albany a cold-blooded murderer? Or was he just a ruthless politician who got what he wanted? We'll never know for sure, but the rumor and the suspicion were enough to poison the political atmosphere. Robert III, a man who had seen his family torn apart by ambition and his kingdom plunged into chaos, made a desperate last move to save his only remaining son, James. He sent him on a ship to France, hoping that the young prince would be safe from the machinations of the Duke of Albany. But as we saw, the ship was captured by English pirates, and the young prince was taken to England. Robert III, heartbroken, died soon after, leaving his kingdom in the hands of the very man he had tried to escape from. His brother, the Duke of Albany, who now ruled as regent, for the imprisoned Prince James. The stage was set for a new kind of monarch to emerge, a king who had spent years in England and had seen firsthand a very different kind of monarchy. The story of James I of Scotland is one of the most remarkable and dramatic of the Stuart dynasty. We left him, a young boy, a prisoner in the court of Henry IV of England. He would remain there for 18 long years, a pawn in the political games between Scotland and England. But these years were not wasted. James was a brilliant and intelligent young man, and he was given a first-rate education at the English court. He was fluent in several languages, a skilled musician and poet, and a keen student of politics. He saw firsthand the workings of a powerful, centralized monarchy, and he began to form a clear idea of the kind of king he wanted to be. He would return to Scotland, not just as the rightful heir, but as a man with a mission to reform his kingdom, to curb the power of the unruly nobles, and to bring the stability and order he had seen in England to his own wild, untamed country. His return to Scotland in 1424, after a massive ransom was paid for his release, was a moment of immense hope for the Scottish people. They had been ruled by the Duke of Albany and his son for years, a period of weak central authority and constant internal strife. James the Firm was seen as the savior, the strong king who would finally bring order. But he was also a man who had a lot of pent-up anger and resentment. He saw the nobles who had failed to pay his ransom and who had profited from his imprisonment as traitors. He was a man with a long memory, and he was about to get his revenge. His campaign of reform was swift and brutal. He began by targeting the most powerful noble family in Scotland, the Albany Stuarts. He arrested the Duke of Albany's son and his most powerful allies, and after a sham trial, he had them all executed. It was a shocking act of political violence, a clear message to the rest of the nobility. I am the king now, and you will obey me. James III's reforms were not just about revenge. He was a true reformer who wanted to create a modern, efficient state. He passed a series of laws aimed at strengthening the crown's authority and weakening the power of the nobles. He created a new system of justice, a bit like a medieval version of a Supreme Court, that would allow the king to hear appeals from all over the country. He also tried to reform the Scottish Parliament, turning it into a more powerful and effective legislative body. He also took on the church, passing laws that were meant to curb the power of the great bishops and make them more accountable to the crown. These reforms were a direct attack on the old decentralized system of government, and they made him a lot of enemies. James, I was a man who believed in absolute power, a king who had no patience for the old ways of doing things. He was a man with a vision, but he was also a man who was willing to use violence to achieve it. He was a brilliant administrator, but he was also a ruthless tyrant in the eyes of his enemies. It's one of those fascinating historical debates. Was James III a great king who brought his country into the modern era? Or was he a paranoid dictator who ruled by fear? Historians still argue about the specifics of his reign, but what is undeniable is that his reforms fundamentally altered the balance of power in Scotland. He had taken on the powerful nobles and won. But he had also created a lot of resentment. The end of his reign was as dramatic as its beginning. A group of nobles, led by his own uncle, assassinated him in 1437. They broke into his monastery bedroom and stabbed him to death. The murder was a tragic end to a reign that had promised so much. But the reforms he had started would not be undone. His successors would continue his work, and the power of the Scottish crown would continue to grow. He had planted the seeds of a new kind of monarchy, a monarchy that was strong, centralized, and determined to bring order to a country that had been plagued by chaos for centuries. The lesson was clear. You could kill the king, but you couldn't kill the idea of a strong central government. The assassination of James I in 1437 left Scotland with another child king, his 6-year-old son, James II. This was a classic moment in Scottish history, a period of royal minority where powerful noble families would once again jostle for control of the country. The central figure of this new struggle was the House of Douglas, an incredibly powerful family that held vast territories in the south and west of Scotland. They were so wealthy and so influential that they were practically a kingdom within a kingdom. James II's reign, therefore, became a dramatic and violent showdown between the crown and the House of Douglas, a struggle for the very soul of the Scottish government. The king's main goal was to complete his father's work, to curb the power of the nobility and create a strong, centralized monarchy. But to do that, he had to take on the most powerful noble family in the land. The early years of James II's reign were a period of intense political maneuvering. Different noble families, like the Livingstons and the Crichtons, fought for control of the young king, who was, in essence, a valuable political prize. The king, a shrewd and intelligent young man, grew up in this environment of paranoia and treachery, and he learned to be just as ruthless as the nobles who surrounded him. His education was a masterclass in survival, and when he finally came of age, he was more than ready to play the game. He slowly began to assert his own authority using the same tactics his father had used, playing one noble family against another and using alliances to his advantage. But the real problem, the elephant in the room, was the power of the Black Douglases. The 8th Earl of Douglas, a man named William, was the head of the family, and he was an arrogant and ambitious man who was a constant threat to the king's authority. He was not just a noble. He was the leader of a powerful faction of nobles who were opposed to the king's centralized rule. The two men, a king and a would-be king, were on a collision course. The climax came in 1452, in a dramatic event that is a true mainstream historical fact. James II invited the Earl of Douglas to Stirling Castle under a promise of safe conduct. The king wanted to get the Earl to break a powerful alliance he had formed with other noble families, an alliance that was a direct threat to the crown. The two men met, and James, in a fit of rage, demanded that the Earl break the alliance. When Douglas refused, James, in a moment of pure, unadulterated anger, drew his dagger and stabbed the Earl to death. It was a shocking act of political violence, an unkingly thing to do. But it was also a desperate act of a king trying to assert his power. The murder of the Earl of Douglas was a massive gamble. The rest of the Douglas family, furious at the murder of their head, rose up in open rebellion. For the next 3 years, Scotland was plunged into a bitter civil war. But James II, a man who had grown up in the shadows of treachery, was a much better politician and military leader than anyone had given him credit for. He managed to play the other noble families against the Douglases, offering them land and titles in exchange for their support. The climax of the war came in 1455 at the Battle of Arkinholm, where the royal army completely routed the Douglas forces. The Douglas family was stripped of their titles and lands, and their castles were demolished. The Black Douglases, a family that had been a dominant force in Scotland for over a century, were gone. The downfall of the Douglases was a turning point. It marked the end of the old feudal system, where a few powerful families could challenge the king's authority. From this point on, the king was the unquestioned head of state, and his power was more centralized than it had ever been before. James II, a king who had started his reign as a child surrounded by rivals, ended it as a powerful and respected monarch. His reign, though short, had fundamentally changed the balance of power in Scotland. He had taken his father's work and completed it, but his story, like his father's, would end in tragedy. James II was killed in 1460 during the siege of Roxburgh Castle, a siege against the English, when one of his own cannons exploded. He had won his civil war, but he had lost his life, leaving another child king to take his place. The death of James II, killed by his own cannon, once again left Scotland with a child on the throne. His son, James III, was just 8 years old when he was crowned, and the country was plunged into another long period of regency. You might think this would have been a chance for the great noble families to rise up again. But James II's crushing of the Black Douglases had left a power vacuum that was not so easily filled. Instead, the court became a complex web of factions, with different groups of nobles vying for control of the young king and his government. The most powerful figure in the early years of James III's reign was his mother, Mary of Guelders, and after her death, a series of powerful regents would try to steer the country. This was a classic medieval drama of power and ambition, a dangerous game of thrones where the king himself was just a pawn. James III grew up in this tumultuous environment, and he became a very different kind of king from his father and grandfather. Unlike his predecessors, he was not a great warrior. He was more of an intellectual, a man with a love for art, architecture, and music. He was more interested in building beautiful chapels and patronizing artists than he was in leading his armies into battle. He surrounded himself with a group of personal favorites, men who were not from the great noble families, but who were often men of modest birth, who shared his love of culture and art. This, as you can imagine, did not go over well with the Scottish nobility. The great lords, who believed that they were the rightful advisors to the king, saw these new men as a threat to their power and influence. They viewed the king as weak, effeminate, and more interested in his hobbies than in ruling the country. This is a topic that historians still argue about. Was James III a misunderstood visionary, or was he a weak and incompetent king who brought his own downfall? The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. The conflict between James and his nobles came to a head in the 1480s. The nobles, led by his own younger brother, the Duke of Albany, and the powerful Earl of Angus, began to openly defy the king. They were a bit like a political opposition party, but one with its own private armies. The king's policies, especially his attempts to make peace with England, were deeply unpopular. Many Scottish nobles saw England as the eternal enemy, and they were not happy with James's diplomatic overtures. The nobles were also angry at the king's personal favorites, a group of men they nicknamed the king's minions. The situation reached a breaking point in 1482 in an event known as the Raid of Lauder. The nobles, a powerful coalition of barons, seized the king at Lauder Bridge, arrested his favorites, and had them all hanged. It was a brutal act of defiance, a clear message to the king that he was not in charge and that he needed to listen to his nobles. James III, a king without an army of his own, was powerless. He was held prisoner for a time and was forced to accept his brother as the new head of government. But he was a stubborn man, and he never gave up his quest for power. He eventually managed to outmaneuver his brother and his other rivals, but he never truly won the trust of his nobility. The rebellion against him continued to simmer, and in 1488 it boiled over into open war. The nobles, once again led by the Earl of Angus, raised an army against the king. The rebellion was not just against the king, but against his policies and his personal rule. The rebels even had a figurehead for their cause, the king's own teenage son, Prince James, who they placed at the head of their army. This was a particularly nasty trick, a way of giving their rebellion a veneer of legitimacy. The two armies met at the Battle of Sochiburn, and the king's forces were defeated. James III himself, fleeing the battlefield, was either killed by a passing soldier or by a rebel who had tracked him down. His death, a tragic and humiliating end for a king who had tried to rule with his mind and not with his sword, marked the end of an era. The nobles had won, and the new king, his son James IV, would take the throne at the head of the rebel army. The reign of James IV, a king who came to power as a rebel leader after the death of his father, marks a new and prosperous era for Scotland. He was a very different kind of king from his father. James IV was a true Renaissance man, handsome, charismatic, and incredibly intelligent. He was fluent in multiple languages, including Gaelic, and was a patron of the arts and sciences. He was a great builder and a man of immense personal energy. He was also a skilled politician who managed to do what his predecessors had failed to do: unite the great noble families behind him. The young king was a popular figure, and he used his personal charm and political savvy to bring a much-needed period of stability to Scotland. He was the kind of king that made people believe in the monarchy again. James IV's greatest political challenge was navigating the complex and often treacherous relationship with England. England, under the brilliant and powerful King Henry VII, was a kingdom on the rise. Henry, a master of diplomacy, was looking for a way to secure his northern border and end the centuries of conflict. James IV, a man who saw the value of peace, was willing to play ball. The two kings, despite their country's long history of animosity, began a series of negotiations that would culminate in a landmark event, the marriage of James IV to Margaret Tudor, the daughter of Henry II. This marriage, which happened in 1503, was a massive political and diplomatic coup, a symbol of a new era of peace between the two kingdoms. It was a union that was celebrated with great pomp and circumstance, and was known as the marriage of the thistle and the rose. This marriage, a mainstream historical fact, was not just about peace. It was also about the long-term future of the two kingdoms. The marriage treaty, known as the Treaty of Perpetual Peace, had a clause that was particularly significant. It stated that the issue of the marriage would have a claim to the English throne. This was a massive deal. It meant that a Stuart could one day become King of England, a possibility that was unthinkable just a few years earlier. It was a massive diplomatic win for James IV, and it showed just how shrewd a politician he was. For a time, the peace held, Scotland prospered, and James IV's court became one of the most brilliant and cosmopolitan in Europe. He was a great naval builder, founding the Royal Scottish Navy and commissioning the Great Michael, a massive warship that was, for a time, the largest in Europe. It was a period of national pride and confidence, a time when Scotland was seen as a major player on the European stage. But the peace was not to last. When Henry VII died, his son, the ambitious and arrogant Henry VIII, took the throne of England. Henry VIII had no intention of honoring his father's peace with Scotland. He was more interested in fighting wars in France, and he was a constant source of friction for James IV. The old alliance with France, which had been dormant for a time, was rekindled, and Scotland once again found itself caught between its two powerful neighbors. James IV, despite his wife being the sister of Henry VIII, found himself in an impossible position. He had to honor his treaty with France, but he also didn't want to go to war with his wife's brother. He tried to be a peacemaker, but it was a role that was doomed to fail. The final act of this tragic drama came in 1513. Henry VIII invaded France, and the French king, a close ally of James IV, appealed to him for help. James IV, torn between his family and his allies, made the fateful decision to invade England. It was a massive gamble, and it was a mistake. The two armies met at the Battle of Flodden, a clash that would prove to be one of the most disastrous in Scottish history. The name Flodden is not just a place on a map. It's a scar on the Scottish psyche, a day of national mourning that would be remembered for centuries. We left James IV, a great and popular king, making the fateful decision to invade England to honor his alliance with France. He gathered the largest Scottish army ever seen and marched south, confident in his abilities and the strength of his forces. The two armies met at Flodden Field in northern England, a battle that would, in a single afternoon, erase a generation of Scottish leadership and change the course of the nation's history. The battle itself, which took place on September 9th, 1513, was a disaster from the very beginning. The Scottish army, which was primarily made up of traditional spearmen, was no match for the English forces, which were led by the Earl of Surrey, and were a well-drilled, professional army. The English army also had a massive advantage in weaponry. The longbow, the Scottish spearmen, those tightly packed schiltrons that had won the day at Bannockburn, were vulnerable to the English archers, who rained arrows down on them from a distance. The Scots, in a moment of tactical brilliance or folly, depending on who you ask, moved their army from a strong defensive position on a hill down into a marshy valley. This move, a crucial and debated mainstream historical fact, left them exposed and vulnerable. The battle itself was a brutal, one-sided affair. The Scottish army, despite fighting with immense bravery, was simply outmatched. The English longbowmen decimated the Scottish ranks, and the English knights, with their superior armor and weaponry, were able to break the Scottish formations. The real tragedy, however, was in the Scottish leadership. James IV, a king who was known for his personal bravery, made the fatal mistake of fighting in the front line with his men. He was killed in the battle, a shocking end for a popular king. But he wasn't the only one. The casualty list for the Scots was a who's who of the Scottish nobility. 2 bishops, 2 abbots, 12 earls, 13 lords, and countless knights and lairds were killed. It was a complete and utter wipeout of the Scottish ruling class. The scale of the disaster was unprecedented. It was said that there was not a single great family in Scotland that did not lose a father, a son, or a brother at Flodden. The flowers of the forest, the best and the brightest of the nation, were gone. The defeat left Scotland in a state of shock and devastation. The country had a new king, a 1-year-old infant named James Turtlesfive, and the country was once again ruled by a regent and a council of guardians. The English, despite their victory, did not invade, a bit of a surprise that historians still debate. They had achieved their goal. They had neutralized the threat from Scotland, and they had broken the Auld Alliance. But the long-term impact on Scotland was immense. The defeat at Flodden ushered in a new era of instability and political intrigue. With the king a baby and the leadership of the country gone, the great noble families once again began to jostle for power. The country was plunged into another long period of regency, a time of factionalism and constant internal conflict. The Queen Mother, Margaret Tudor, who was now a widow, tried to assert her authority, but she was a foreigner, a woman, and a Tudor, and she was viewed with deep suspicion by the Scottish nobles. Her subsequent marriages to powerful Scottish nobles only made the political situation more complicated. The legacy of Flodden was not just a military defeat, it was a political one, a trauma that would haunt the nation for the next century. The country, which had been so strong and prosperous under James IV, was now on its knees, a kingdom in search of a new direction and a new king who could once again unite it. The aftermath of Flodden left Scotland in a state of deep chaos, with an infant king, a heartbroken nation, and a political vacuum that was filled by ambitious, feuding nobles. The new king, James V, would spend his early years as a pawn in a power struggle between his mother, Margaret Tudor, and his stepfathers, first Archibald Douglas, the Earl of Angus, and later the powerful nobles who opposed the English influence at court. It was a miserable childhood. a life spent being shuffled from one powerful noble's castle to another. He learned early on that he couldn't trust anyone, and this would shape him into a paranoid, secretive, and deeply cynical king. He was a man who, like his grandfather James III, believed in the absolute power of the monarch and was determined to crush the nobility that had so tormented him. When James V finally came of age, he did so with a brutal and dramatic flair. In 1528, he escaped from the clutches of the Douglases and declared himself king in his own right. His first act was to exile the Douglas family from Scotland, a mainstream historical fact that showed his determination to break the power of the great magnates. He then began a campaign to assert his authority over the entire kingdom. He was a hands-on king who was known to travel the country in disguise, a bit like a medieval version of a detective, to see for himself how his people were being treated. He was also a king who was not afraid to use violence. He had a number of nobles executed, a clear message to the rest of the country that he was not a man to be trifled with. James V's reign was a period of relative stability, but it was also a time of immense political and religious turmoil. Just south of the border, the English Reformation was in full swing. Henry VIII, who was now James's uncle, had broken with the Catholic Church and was busy dissolving the monasteries and seizing their wealth. This created a massive problem for James. He was a devout Catholic and a staunch defender of the Church, but he was also a king who needed money. He was tempted by the wealth of the Scottish monasteries, and he was under constant pressure from Henry to join the Reformation. The Scottish nobles were also deeply divided on the issue. Some, who had ties to England, were in favor of a Protestant Scotland, while others, who had ties to France, were in favor of remaining Catholic. James V, with his characteristic paranoia, refused to choose a side. He remained a staunch Catholic, but he also refused to go to war with England. He played a delicate diplomatic game, trying to balance the power of England and France. He strengthened the old alliance by marrying two French princesses in succession, a move that made him the most Christian king in the eyes of the French and the Pope. But it also infuriated his uncle, Henry VIII, who saw it as a betrayal. The relationship between the two kings soured, and the constant friction finally led to war. In 1542, James V's army was routed at the Battle of Solway Moss, a humiliating defeat that broke the king's spirit. The tragedy of James V was that he died just a few weeks later, a broken man at the age of 30. His cause of death is a matter of speculation, but it's often said that he died of a broken heart. His last words, upon hearing that his wife had given birth to a daughter, were, "It cam we alas, and it'll gang we alas," a reference to the fact that the Stuart dynasty had come to the throne through a woman, and now, it seemed, would end with a woman. That baby girl, Mary, Queen of Scots, was just 6 days old when she became queen. James V had left his country in an even more precarious position than he had found it. The Reformation was on the horizon. The great nobles were still a threat, and the country was once again ruled by an infant. The stage was set for the final and most dramatic act of the medieval Scottish story. The story of Mary, Queen of Scots, is one of the most romantic and tragic in all of Scottish history. A tale of a queen who was born into a kingdom on the brink of change, and who, in her short and tumultuous reign, would see it all come crashing down. Mary, a Stuart by birth, was born just days before her father's death, and was a queen from the moment of her birth. Her early life was a whirlwind of political intrigue. The English, under Henry VIII, saw her as the key to uniting the two kingdoms, and they proposed a marriage between Mary and Henry's son, Edward. But the Scots, with their strong ties to France, rejected the idea. This led to a period of border warfare known as the Rough Wooing, where the English tried to force the marriage, a brutal and ultimately unsuccessful campaign. To protect their queen, the Scots sent her to France, a crucial, mainstream historical fact that would shape the rest of her life. Mary was raised in the French court, a place of immense wealth and culture, and she was, by all accounts, a brilliant and beautiful young woman. She married the French Dauphin, Francis, who would later become king, making her the Queen of France as well. For a time, it seemed as though her life would be a fairy tale. But tragedy struck when Francis died just a year into his reign, leaving Mary a childless widow at the age of 18. She was no longer the Queen of France, and with her mother-in-law, Catherine de' Medici, a powerful and intimidating figure, she made the difficult decision to return to Scotland in 1561. But Scotland was a very different place from the one she had left. While Mary was in France, the Protestant Reformation had taken hold in Scotland. John Knox, a fiery and charismatic preacher, had returned to the country and was leading a religious revolution. The Scottish Parliament had, with his encouragement, outlawed the Catholic Mass and established a Protestant church. Mary, a devout Catholic queen, was now the monarch of a Protestant kingdom, and it was a recipe for disaster. The conflict between Mary and Knox was a clash of titans, a struggle between a queen who believed in the divine right of kings and a preacher who believed in the supremacy of God's word. It was a fascinating and deeply personal conflict that would define the era. Mary's reign was a constant struggle for power and legitimacy. She was a political outsider in her own country, and she was constantly undermined by her Protestant nobles, who saw her Catholicism as a threat. Her personal life was also a mess. She married her cousin, Lord Darnley, a handsome but deeply unpleasant man, and the marriage was a disaster. Darnley was an ambitious and jealous man, and he was a constant source of friction at court. In a moment of madness and paranoia, he led a group of nobles in the murder of Mary's secretary, David Rizzio, right in front of the pregnant queen. It was a shocking act of violence that broke the trust between Mary and Darnley. The end of their relationship came a year later, when Darnley was murdered in a mysterious explosion. Mary then made her final and most disastrous mistake. She married the man widely believed to be Darnley's murderer, the Earl of Bothwell. This act of political and personal recklessness was the final straw for the Scottish nobility. Mary's nobles, who had been divided for so long, finally united against her. They rose up in rebellion, and Mary was forced to abdicate her throne in favor of her infant son, James VI. She was imprisoned in Lochleven Castle, but she managed to escape and raise an army. Her forces were defeated at the Battle of Langside, and she fled to England, hoping for help from her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I. But Elizabeth, a Protestant queen who saw Mary as a Catholic rival with a legitimate claim to her throne, was not so welcoming. She had Mary imprisoned for the next 19 years, and in 1587, after Mary was implicated in a plot to assassinate her, Elizabeth had her executed. Mary's death was a tragic and brutal end to the life of a queen who had tried to rule her country, only to be crushed by the forces of politics and religion. Her son, James VI, would eventually inherit the English throne, uniting the two crowns in a peaceful act, a legacy that would be the final chapter of the medieval story, the long and winding story of medieval Scotland, a narrative born in the post-Roman chaos and forged in the crucible of war, finally fades into the twilight. It's a story of warriors and kings, of poets and preachers, of a land that was shaped by a constant struggle for identity and independence. We've seen a patchwork of kingdoms become a single nation, a nation that was nearly destroyed by a powerful neighbor, only to be reborn through the bravery of men like Wallace and Bruce. We've seen the rise and fall of dynasties, from the bloody dynasty of the early kings to the tragic reigns of the Stuarts. As the final light of the medieval era dims, we are left with the echoes of this long and turbulent past. The castles that stand as silent sentinels, the abbeys that lie in ruins, and the songs that are still sung of battles long past, all stand as a testament to the people who built this nation. The story doesn't end here, of course. Scotland would continue to face new challenges and find new strengths. But for now, as the last words of this long tale drift into the quiet of the night, let yourself be lulled into a gentle sleep. The history of this ancient land will always be there, waiting for you to dream about.